Many independent games come out nowadays with a lofty dream of delivering a gameplay experience with remarkable production value that even most AAA studios can't offer, usually because of countless barriers of bureaucracy and red tape. But sadly, not all of those ambitious indie projects manage to stick the landing. Sometimes they're scaled back down, heavily delayed, and maybe even outright cancelled. Even in spite of the developers' grand ideas and willingness to commit to the work, it seems like the gap between independent games and AAA games is almost impossible to close. That is, until Sandfall Interactive decided to join the game. Founded in France in 2020, Sandfall is led by 3 former Ubisoft developers who wanted to carve their own path with the particular goal of showing the world that an independent studio can indeed leverage current game-making technology to create high-fidelity and deeply interactive games that reach the quality only thought to be achievable by the biggest companies in the industry. But how exactly did they plan to do that? Well, turns out, the creative director and CEO of the studio, Guillaume Broche, is a big fan of Japanese RPGs, namely Final Fantasy, Persona, Lost Odyssey, and others. By creating a demo and showing it around to other developers and potential investors, Guillaume was able to secure funding from Kepler Interactive, which officially kicked off the development of the project. Staying true to its new independent roots, the newly established Sandfall would find more talent in special places. For example, the game's lead writer, Jennifer Svedberg-Yen, was found on Reddit and was initially a voice actor for the project before being in charge of crafting the game's story. And the game's composer, Lorien Testard, was found through comments on SoundCloud. As time passed, Sandfall's ragtag team was coming together with a total of 3 project leaders from Ubisoft and 30 junior developers with less overall experience. According to Guillaume, it is a very young team, and eventually this fresh-faced collection of devs introduced their game to the world as Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, a turn-based RPG with impressive production value and a cast of recognizable names, including Jennifer English and Ben Starr of Baldur's Gate 3 and Final Fantasy XVI respectively, Charlie Cox of Daredevil fame, and Andy Serkis. It seemed a little too good to be true. A small, brand new French studio delivering a high-fidelity RPG experience with a stacked cast. It seems like a catch had to have been hidden in there somewhere, like the game being hyperlinear and only 8 hours long or something, or maybe the gameplay is super shallow and barely allowed for any real customization that any decent RPG would offer. There's gotta be something inherently weak about the experience for such a new studio to give us such excellent production value. There's gotta be some major sacrifice. There's no way an indie studio of mostly junior developers can tick all the boxes of a AAA JRPG, right? Well, the game released, I bought it, and I beat it, and now it's time for me to give my 2 cents. So let's end this prologue and dive into the review. Clair Obscur Expedition 33 takes place in a dark fantasy Belle Epoque setting, meaning France between the late 1800s to early 1900s. The primary location is the city of Lumiere, an isolated island that broke apart from the rest of the continent in a disastrous event called the Fracture. But that's not even the worst of it. Every year, the people of Lumiere suffer an event called the Gommage, where a mysterious entity called the Paintress writes an ever-decreasing number on a monolith in the horizon, and that number is the oldest age that the people of Lumiere are allowed to live to, and everyone above that age fades away, never to return. After every Gommage, an expedition is sent to the mainland in an effort to destroy the Paintress and prevent another Gommage from happening. And now that the maximum achievable age is 33, that means the next expedition is appropriately called Expedition 33. This expedition is where most of our playable characters come in. There's Gustave, an engineer, Maëlle, a teenager and Gustave's foster sister who would rather join the expedition than wait for death at Lumiere, Lune, a scholar and skilled mage, and Ciel, a seemingly happy-go-lucky fighter. The remaining two characters you meet along the way are Verso, a mysterious man who helps the expedition for his own reasons, and Monoko, a Gestral warrior who has the ability to mimic the attacks of Nevrons, the primary enemies of the game. If you've seen Expedition 33 in action already, then it probably comes as no surprise that this world and its characters are a major strong point of the experience. No expense was spared in crafting the most fantastical little universe Sandfall could put together, rife with imagination, color, and some of the most jaw-dropping views, vistas, environments, and skyboxes I have ever witnessed in a game before. While the actual levels are somewhat tight and pretty linear, which I'll get into later, the game's incredible art direction and cleverly laid out scope combine to make everything feel so much larger than it actually is. It's pretty remarkable. One detail that I didn't fully notice until later that makes me realize how it pulled this presentation off is the fact that almost every single explorable area in the game is outdoors, or at the very least in a very open space with a ceiling that's probably dozens if not hundreds of meters overhead. The game refuses to confine the player to physically tight spaces, and this does wonders for the art, atmosphere, and production of the world. Every time you enter a new area, you're almost forced to look up, because that's where most of the magic is. These highly imaginative and super detailed locations make me feel as if the art and level design team at Sandfall had a blast putting the game together. It feels like the game was a canvas that allowed them to let loose their wildest aesthetic dreams. If you were to ask me to list areas that impressed me, I would say an easier list is areas that didn't impress me because it would probably have 0 entries. And I haven't even touched on the world map yet, which is just as beautiful and meticulously detailed and feels huge thanks to thoughtful design. As for the characters of Expedition 33, they are amazing. This has got to be one of the most well-rounded casts I've ever had the pleasure of adventuring with in a JRPG in recent years. They are a variety of personalities and motivations, but not once do they ever feel two-dimensional or one-note. They don't just look like real people, they sound and act like real people too. For anyone who enjoys those quiet, personal character moments, the game regularly has you stay the night at camp, which presents the opportunity to hang out with all party members one by one, which is where you learn about them and even increase your relationship level with them, which unlocks abilities to use in combat. I mentioned earlier the absolutely stacked cast the game has, and people might assume that some individuals like Charlie Cox and Andy Serkis, who are Hollywood names, might only have 10 lines and a couple scenes they could have completed in a single lunch break. But that's not true. Everyone in this cast is used excellently. Everyone brings that gravitas, that presence needed to really bring forth the emotion and impact behind every scene. There's intent in almost every line of dialogue, especially with the ever-present sensation of French ennui that pops up pretty regularly, especially in the first act. And it is a very French game, in every way that matters. Some cutscenes change to a black and white filter in a filmic 4:3 aspect ratio, as if directed by Jean Cocteau. Every character is either a poet, an artist, or a scientist, and everyone's got a clever aphorism to share. And if it were handled with any less finesse, it would be kind of annoying, but it's not. It's a type of storytelling and characterization that I don't see that much from American and Japanese-made games. I like that I can feel the Frenchness of the story and its characters. It's all very endearing and charismatic, and it rightly sprinkles in some good humor and sincere moments of happiness and friendship as well. The storytelling also becomes even deeper as you progress and witness the various twists and turns, and then go back and re-examine everything you know with this new context. Now, I won't go into spoiler territory, but believe me when I say that many small details, even down to skill names that you might dismiss as simple flavor, relates to something important regarding a character. And it still doesn't stop there. Enemy and boss designs are also really neat. Some are weird yet fascinating, some are creepy and unsettling, some are whimsical and mysterious, and some are just straight up goofy. Expedition 33 succeeds in creating a variety of everything regarding the visual spectacle, and Enemies to Fight is no different. The roster is huge and there's some very memorable encounters. Another huge contributor to the magnificent production value of this game is the music. I must say, every time a song begins to play in this game, I am blown away by the fact that this guy, Lorien Testard, was just found on SoundCloud. It really drives the fact that incredible talent is just sitting at home waiting to be discovered and given the right opportunity. It's a popular joke to say that a person didn't need to go so hard on something, but I think that's actually a little true here. I feel like there's no way that Guillaume, the director, specifically asked Lorien for 150 tracks of pure fire, but that's what Lorien delivered. Dozens of beautiful, epic, emotional, operatic pieces that elevate the mood of every scene they're used in. And one of the coolest tracks features vocals from Victor Borba, who was the vocalist of one of the greatest video game songs of all time, Bury the Light. The original soundtrack of Expedition 33 is just awesome. It truly delivers on everything you would hope a top-tier RPG soundtrack would deliver on. And I imagine this is going to kick off a very, very fruitful career for Lorien. Now, I've spent all this time gushing about the art direction, but what about the graphical fidelity and performance? One of Sandfall's primary goals is to show that they can leverage current-day development technology to deliver on AAA visuals despite their small team size. So, did they accomplish that? Expedition 33 was made in Unreal Engine 5, and while some people might groan at that because it feels like so few games actually take advantage of the features it offers to truly differentiate themselves from other games on the engine, this game is different. Sandfall manages to really squeeze as much as they feasibly can out of UE5 to make the game's world as crisp as possible. The textures are sharp, the shadows are clean, the lighting is beautiful, and the reflections are decently accurate, though blurred and diffused so they're more subdued. Even the tiniest little details in the environment receive accurate lighting and shading, and with seemingly little impact on performance. I played the PlayStation 5 version of the game on a base console, and like many other titles, this one offers two performance modes, quality and frame rate. And frankly, from what I can tell with my own two eyes, the difference is honestly quite minimal. The only sacrifice that seems to be made in order to achieve 60 frames per second is lighting and reflections, but everything else seems more or less the same. This is excellent news for those who want to play the game at a solid 60 FPS without suffering horribly blurry image quality like other games force on you. But if you are a graphics maximalist and want to stay in quality mode, then you can do that too and still maintain a consistent 30 FPS, except during some cutscenes, weirdly enough. If there's any issue I have with the actual fidelity of this game, it's probably the occasional pre-rendered cutscenes. Now there's only a few, but they are pretty noticeable because their bit rates are not high enough to prevent visible blocking and bitmapping. Despite the game being on Unreal Engine 5, it comes in at a surprisingly conservative 41-ish gigabytes in size. So Sandfall could have upped the quality of these cutscenes without too much risk of going over that 50 gigabyte threshold. But at the end of the day, it's not that crucial. As it stands, the in-game cutscenes are actually impressive in their own right, visually speaking. And of course, there's also loading times, but at this point, it shouldn't be a surprise that a PS5 game loads fast. Expedition 33 has loading screen tips, but they're almost useless because of how quick the game loads. You have to be able to read fairly quickly to actually absorb what those tips say. Now, with everything else out of the way, it's time to get into the meat and potatoes of the experience, the gameplay. And there's a shocking amount of stuff to touch on because if you've never seen combat or any footage surrounding it, then you might probably assume the game is far more shallow than it actually is. This is where the JRPG influences really show up, and this game shamelessly wears its influences on its sleeve, for better and for more better, actually. But before we dive into the crazy stuff, let's talk about world structure. Expedition 33 follows a very traditional JRPG format here, by giving you a series of locations separated only by travel across a world map with a distorted scale. If you played almost any JRPG from the 90s, then you know exactly what I'm talking about. The areas themselves are quite linear, but that doesn't mean they're always easy to navigate. With the environments being so dense with detail, and some locations having multiple intersections and loop-arounds, there will be moments where you will actually kinda wish the game had a minimap, but thankfully, there's a checkpoint system in the form of expedition flags. They basically work like bonfires in Souls games. They let you allocate attribute points you gain when you level up, and if you decide to rest to heal your party and refill your resources, enemies will respawn, and you're able to fast travel to other expedition flags you found in the same area. So even though some places can get kinda confusing with their layout, you'll be totally fine as long as you keep exploring and find a flag. As far as actual traversal goes, you're not just running around. There's a number of movement mechanics that'll get some use, specifically jumping, climbing, vertical ropes, and zip lines. And there's some areas that will demand some platforming out of you. It's not great platforming, if I'm being blunt, but like the other mechanics, it prevents the feeling of monotony you would get if you just held forward and ran. Overall, areas in the game are very cleverly designed, and I sincerely struggled to think of any single area that felt like it overstayed its welcome. That is a pretty big deal to me because I am easily susceptible to environmental fatigue, I guess you can call it. I honestly hate staying in the same area for too long, but Expedition 33 has such a huge variety of locations, and none of them force you to stick around longer than you feel like you need to. It makes everything go by so smoothly and makes exploration feel fun and exciting instead of a chore you have to do because you might miss out on something if you don't. But that's not to say there's no hidden treasures around the game. There absolutely is, and some of them are well hidden, but they are worth getting. With the world map, however, things are a tiny bit different. If you've played an old school JRPG with an old school world map, then you pretty much know what to expect. You start the game off on foot, which limits how far you're able to go, then eventually you're able to cross the seas, then eventually you're able to take to the skies. And this is a game where flying is quite a treat in a visual sense, and not just in regards to convenience, because the world map of Expedition 33 is crammed with imagination and detail. You're not solely entering the map to move around. There are still enemies to fight, items to pick up, and merchants to talk to. And some enemies and some items are only found on this world map, so exploration is just as crucial here as it is in normal areas. There's also a handful of side quest lines scattered around that range from brief detours to somewhat significant subplots with their own cutscenes. I won't go into details out of caution for spoilers, but some of these quest lines have a lot to contribute to the overall story. It's almost shocking that they're optional. Basically, wandering around this gorgeous setting is very rewarding and rarely becomes tiresome. There's so much to see and so many goodies to find and new pieces of content to experience. The game manages to not only faithfully recreate the feeling of adventure offered by its most prestigious influences, in some cases it surpasses them too. Now, let's head over to what is likely the most publicized aspect of the game, the combat. The game is advertised as being turn-based, which is true, but it's a little more complicated than that. Sandful has decided to adopt the label of reactive turn-based combat, which references the fact that dodging and parrying are still very important aspects of fighting despite the game's turn-based structure. This isn't a particularly new idea. The concept of dodging and parrying attacks in a turn-based RPG goes back to at least Super Mario RPG, but recent games do it too. For example, Like a Dragon 7 and 8 have a perfect block mechanic that cuts down damage with a well-timed button press. However, Expedition 33 takes things to the next level. The dodge and parry system in this game is such a deeply ingrained part of the combat experience that there are bosses that are designed to completely fuck you up if you don't know how to parry. This sounds interesting at first, but it could be disastrous in the wrong hands. I've mentioned before in other videos how I don't like parry mechanics when they're the only way to defend yourself or survive, especially when the game pretends they aren't. However, Sandfall seems to know that this sucks too, and Expedition 33 doesn't actually put a gun to your head about it. Parrying has a tight window. The enemy's attack has to be inside your character already for the correct timing more often than not. Sometimes it's straight up wrong to hit the parry button just before the attack actually connects. Thankfully though, many enemies, including bosses, are not so punishing that your team is going to be shredded in an instant if you miss one parry. Those types of fights are usually for the optional bosses, of which there are many, and they are spread across several levels of challenge. For example, there are optional bosses you can fight as you progress through the game, where you enter a new area and find the boss tucked away in their own little corner. They are tough, but doable as you are right now, so long as you can parry. Then you have bosses spread around the world map that vary from pretty tough to extremely tough. And then you have a couple of endgame super bosses that could take hours upon hours of practice, assuming you don't just nuke them with a super-powered build, which is possible. Parrying is a challenge that is ever evolving throughout the game. Different enemies have different attacks with very different timings. Some of them are very simple and have a very clear rhythm to it that's easy to learn. Others are completely ruthless scumbags with huge delays and fake-outs, and they will get you. Make no mistake, you will eventually reach an enemy who totally makes you flinch over and over again. Some enemies hit you over a dozen times in a single turn, but the pattern is always learnable, and in my time with the game, I've noticed that most attacks tend to rely on audio cues much more often than visual ones, so practicing parries will probably go smoother if you listen more than watch. Overall though, it is a very satisfying mechanic that rarely ever feels like too much to handle. If you do suck at parrying because you're just bad at timing-based mechanics, you can lower the difficulty, which adds a bit of leeway to timing windows. But if you suck so much that even that doesn't help, you can still build your characters in such a way that they become brick walls that can survive some particularly nasty attacks. As for the rest of the combat experience, there's some neat stuff to mention, like the Persona-inspired presentation and the Final Fantasy X-inspired turn order display with turn frequency being determined by the agility stat. There's also a free aim mechanic where any character can spend ability points to get some free ranged attacks in before finishing their turn with a normal attack or a skill if they have any leftover ability points to spend. Skills are also worth mentioning, because they can have a ton of different effects, both buffs on your team and debuffs on your enemies, as well as other effects that influence other mechanics. Now, if there's any criticism that I have for the skill system, it's the fact that characters are only limited to having 6 skills available at once, which seems like a very arbitrary limit considering that each character's skill tree offers 20 or so, and it also seems like an unnecessary limit simply because it's very possible, and honestly quite easy, to turn any character into a walking nuke regardless. Now this is where the character progression system comes in, and I would honestly argue that it's more appealing than the reactive combat, at least for those of you who seriously appreciate open-ended systems that let you turn your individual party members into any type of tool you want them to be. I already mentioned skill trees, so let's move on to attributes, the simplest part of character progression. When you level up, you get 3 points to put into 5 attributes: vitality, might, agility, defense, and luck. They're pretty self-explanatory. Vitality is health, might is attack power, agility is speed, defense is, well, defense, and luck is about critical hits. These attributes are important because different attributes affect the scaling of different weapons. And this is the second part of character progression. There's actually a ton of different weapons for every character in the game, and they have a huge variety of effects that come with them. Every weapon has up to 3 effects that unlock at different weapon levels, so upgrading them will be necessary not only to power them up, but to unlock those useful effects, and some of them are wild. I won't go into specifics, but they can be crucial to building your team into a death squad. This leads directly into the final and most complicated part of character progression: Pictos and Luminas. Basically, Pictos are a combination of equipable effects, called Luminas, plus stat upgrades they come with. Each character on your team only has 3 Picto slots. However, when you equip a Picto and win 4 battles with that character on the active team, then all party members unlock the associated effect, the Lumina, and are able to equip it on its own using Lumina points, which are not limited, and you can theoretically grind enough Lumina points to allow all characters to equip all Luminas in the game. This probably sounded a little confusing, so let me repeat it in a simpler way. Essentially, Pictos are a Lumina effect plus a stat increase, and you can only equip 3. But Luminas, by themselves, are not limited, so you can have as many equipped as you can allow with your character's Lumina points. If you still don't fully get it, that's fine. You'll understand when you play the game yourself. The important thing to know, though, is that the fact that there is no limit to putting Luminas on any single member of your party means that you can turn anyone into any type of tool or weapon, and they can be extremely, ridiculously effective at it. Want one character to debuff the shit out of enemies in a single turn? You can do that. Want another character to be able to shoot 50 free aim shots in a row by regaining AP in a massive loop? You can do that too. Want another character to instantly stun enemies by dying as soon as the fight starts and then automatically reviving and gaining buffs on revive? That's completely possible. Or, for you lone wolf badasses out there, you can equip a bunch of Luminas that buff a character who is fighting by themselves. I seriously cannot stress enough how insanely open-ended and potentially broken the Lumina system is. If I were to sit here and go over every insane plan or tactic you can use through crazy Lumina loadouts, I would be here all day. In a very strange way, the Lumina system kind of feels like what the Junction system was going for in Final Fantasy VIII. I know that's probably a weird comparison, but I think if you really experiment with it, you'll see where I'm coming from. It's an ingenious system, and I really love it. Sandfall made an absolutely bonkers mechanic, but in a good way. However, because the Lumina system is so lenient, this leads me to my one and only real criticism about character progression. It's the simple fact that if you are even just somewhat thorough in your exploration and just a little bit clever with your character planning, you can easily make your whole party very overpowered compared to the challenges around them. I've seen it already. Some people are already annihilating bosses with little effort before the end of Act 1. Even I hit the damage cap with a few characters before the halfway point of the story, and I wasn't even trying to min-max or be super efficient. Now, of course, if you're just blitzing through the story-critical content and not really concentrating too hard on Pictos and Luminas, you're probably following the escalation of challenge properly. But with just a tiny bit of effort, you can suddenly turn everything around you into a joke, which may be rewarding to some of you, but disappointing to others who want a consistent challenge. So bumping the game's difficulty up to expert might be necessary. And we're still not done with the combat, because there's also character-specific mechanics to touch on. Every single playable character has their own unique mechanic that serves as a core for how you want to play them. The game doesn't force you to do anything specific, but simply offers this mechanic as a sort of platform to build off of, and this is reflected in each character's weapons too. For example, Verso has a perfection mechanic where he has a rank that goes from D to S as long as he attacks and avoids damage. If that sounds familiar, that's because Devil May Cry is one of the game's director Guillaume cited as an influence. The cool thing is that Verso's attack power also increases with each rank, so you have a very practical reason to get him to S rank as soon as possible and keep him there. And that's something that you can accomplish with the right weapon and luminas. You also have Mael's stance mechanic, where she has 4 fighting stances she switches between: stanceless, offensive, defensive, and virtuose. Stanceless is her default and offers no bonuses. Offensive increases her attack power, but also increases the damage she takes. Defensive increases her damage resistance and her AP gain, and Virtuose stance is a flat damage increase of 200%. Thus, you ideally want to get Mael in Virtuose stance as soon as possible and keep her there. But there might be some circumstances where switching between multiple stances is a good idea too. All other playable characters have something that makes controlling them unique in this way. Gustave has his mechanical arm that requires charges, Lune has stains that she can create and consume to power up her magic, Ciel has cards that can increase her power or apply debuffs, and Monoko is straight up a blue mage who can copy enemy abilities. Everyone has something cool they can do, and it's completely exclusive to them. It makes every party member interesting to use and develop. And of course, what would this RPG be without New Game Plus? It's a pretty standard version of it, allowing you to bring your characters and their progress into a new game with increased difficulty that is scaled to endgame strength. So it's a good opportunity to further challenge yourself if you found the regular game kinda easy, even on expert difficulty. It's also useful for getting more Lumina points in a more natural way instead of just grinding 1 or 2 fights over and over and over again. I won't say any spoilers, but it's also a good opportunity to re-experience the story with the new context and information you got from New Game. Now, before we close out this review, there is one thing about the game that I do want to touch on, and I decided to save it for the end here because, frankly, it's not really a criticism, and I do not want to frame it as one. It's more an observation that I want to acknowledge, because I've seen other people bring this up, and I want you to know that I noticed this too, but I don't think it's really a problem. Expedition 33 and Sandfall in general want to achieve AAA-like production value without spending the exorbitant amount of money or spending nearly a decade on the project, which is an amazing goal to reach. I support it with zero hesitance, and they have nailed that AAA feeling by about 99%. However, it's that final 1% that's hardest to accomplish, because it's where the money truly shows itself in actual AAA productions. The observation I want to bring up is that, in spite of how utterly gorgeous the world is, you don't really have any direct effect on it. Nothing in the beautiful environments you see are interactable in a way that would make them change. There's no physics to anything, rocks don't roll, small furniture and decorations don't tip over. With the exception of foliage swaying as you pass through it, nothing reacts to you. Tiny details like that would actually make you and your character feel like a tangible presence in the world they are supposed to inhabit. The game's environments are so dense with detail, you will eventually feel the desire to get up close to something and maybe influence it in some way. Maybe by walking into it to see if it moves, but that will never happen. Everything is a static object that is there to be admired, not touched. Now that's not an inherently bad thing, because not every piece of scenery needs to be interactable. As long as it simply adds to the mood and beauty of the setting, then it's doing its job. But another way this observation manifests is animations. The lip syncing during normal gameplay conversations isn't great, and when the camera is zoomed out enough to see the character's feet, you can see them sorta slide around because they're not completely anchored to the ground. There are also moments of minor platforming in the game, and the mantling and falling animations seem to be the stock Unreal Engine animations. Now, I'm not 100% sure though, so don't quote me on it. I would not want Sandfall Interactive to spend an extra several months and however many more dollars or euros just to sprinkle minute physics interactions or a few more original animations across the game. It doesn't strictly need it. In fact, as their debut project, they are right to save time wherever they could. The game already uses pre-made Unreal Engine assets like rocks and trees, which definitely saved time and money. But those are very basic environmental things that no one will really scrutinize, like the animations of the main characters. Now again, I do not want this to be a criticism, because it is very nitpicky and honestly kind of unfair, because this is simply a product of the game being an indie project and not a product of any explicit oversight or incompetence or deliberate bad decision. I am a firm believer that it's the tiny flashes of quirkiness, jankiness, or weird idiosyncrasies that give a game its character, and that's why I don't think this is a complaint worth underlining that much. However, if Sandfall truly wants to close the gap between themselves and true AAA quality, then this one final % of minute details is the last hurdle to get over. They don't need to spend time or money doing so, but if they believe it's something they should eventually do in order to accomplish their goal, then it's there. With that all being said though, Clair Obscur Expedition 33 walks away still being the whole package. For a game made by a brand new French team made up of mostly young junior developers, it manages to somehow tick off every box that every JRPG it's influenced by ticks off as well. It's a game that wears its inspirations on its sleeve in the best way possible. The story is emotionally involving, the world is fantastical and interesting, the combat is addicting and very gratifying, character progression is insanely open-ended, the music is absorbing and beautiful, the art direction is mesmerizing, the enemy designs are cool, the level design is complex but not too complex, the graphics are crisp, character models are immaculate, and voice performances are excellent. This is the type of game that becomes more impressive as you play, where more strengths pop up as you sink more hours into it instead of more weaknesses. It's still not completely flawless, of course, but that's okay. If you held a gun to my head and forced me to be critical of some things, I could be, but those criticisms still wouldn't add up to make any significant impact on my perception of the overall experience. It truly is that much of a rock-solid game. As someone who has always believed that AAA games spend too much time and money on products that ultimately don't feel like they justify those expenditures, I am very glad for this game's existence and success, and I sincerely hope to see more from Sandfall Interactive in the future. This concludes my review of Clair Obscur Expedition 33. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.
Sera ravi, les toits à ce